People often think betrayal begins with a lie. It doesn't. Most of the time, it begins with trust. The kind of trust that makes you open your home, your heart, your future, and hand someone the keys without ever imagining they might use them against you. My name is Olivia Carter, and for 8 years, I believed I had built a beautiful life. I was wrong. But I didn't know that yet. 8 years earlier, Dallas was in the middle of one of those brutally hot summers that seemed determined to melt the city into the pavement. I was 31 years old, running a rapidly growing logistics company and working more hours than any sane person should. That was when I met Ethan Brooks. He wasn't wealthy. He wasn't successful. And he certainly wasn't the type of man my friends expected me to marry. When we first met, he was carrying nearly $90,000 in student loan debt. He was bouncing between temporary jobs. His apartment was a cramped one-bedroom unit in an aging complex on the edge of the city. The air conditioner barely worked. The refrigerator rattled all night. The kitchen table doubled as his office desk. But Ethan had something I thought mattered more than money. He was kind. Or at least, he seemed kind. He listened when I talked. He remembered little things. He made me laugh after 12-hour workdays when I was too exhausted to smile. One evening, while we sat on the balcony of his apartment eating takeout Chinese food, he looked embarrassed as he glanced around the tiny space. I know this isn't exactly impressive. I laughed. Ethan, it's an apartment. It's a bad apartment. It's still yours. He stared at me for a moment. You really don't care about money, do you? I shrugged. I care whether someone has character. At the time, I believed he did. When we got married 2 years later, I thought we were building a future together. What I didn't realize was that most of the foundation was being built by me. I helped him pay down a huge portion of his student loans. Not because he asked. Because I wanted us to start our marriage without financial chains dragging behind us. When a management position opened at one of our partner companies, I recommended him. When he doubted himself, I encouraged him. When he struggled, I supported him. When he succeeded, I celebrated him. Every promotion, every raise, every achievement, I was proud of him. Proud in the way a wife should be. The house came before the wedding. A year before Ethan and I got married, I purchased my dream home. A beautiful estate in North Dallas. Nearly 7,000 square feet. Large windows overlooking a private garden. A library with floor-to-ceiling shelves. A backyard pool surrounded by oak trees. I had worked 16-hour days for years to afford it. I signed those documents alone. Made every mortgage payment myself. Built every room from a vision I carried long before I met Ethan. But after the wedding, I never referred to it as my house. I always called it our home. Maybe that was my first mistake. Then came the second. 6 months after our wedding, Ethan approached me carefully one evening. My mom's having a hard time back in Oklahoma. I looked up from my laptop. What happened? She's struggling financially. I didn't even hesitate. Then she should come stay with us. Relief flooded his face. Really? Of course. 3 months later, Margaret Brooks moved into our home. I gave her the guest suite on the first floor. The largest guest room in the house. A private bathroom. Garden view. Everything. A year after that, Rachel moved in too. Ethan's younger sister had been accepted into a university near Dallas. Student housing was expensive. I offered her a room without charging $1. At first, both women thanked me constantly. Margaret baked pies. Rachel hugged me. They called me family. But gratitude has a strange expiration date in some people. Over time, the thank yous disappeared. The requests increased. Then the demands. Slowly, almost invisibly, kindness became expectation. And expectation became entitlement. Rachel borrowed clothes without asking. Margaret criticized how I cooked. How I decorated. How I worked. How often I traveled. Some days, I came home from managing a company with hundreds of employees only to be treated like an unwelcome guest in my own house. Still, I stayed patient. Because I loved Ethan. And because of something else. Something none of us ever fully recovered from. 5 years ago, I became pregnant. It happened after nearly 2 years of trying. I still remember the look on Ethan's face when I showed him the test. He lifted me off the floor and spun me around the kitchen. We laughed. We cried. We dreamed. For months, everything felt perfect. We painted a nursery. Bought tiny clothes. Argued about baby names. Margaret was suddenly sweet. Rachel acted excited. For the first time, everyone seemed united. Then one afternoon, everything changed. There was blood. Too much blood. The emergency room lights blurred together. Doctors rushed in and out. Machines beeped. People spoke in hushed voices. Hours later, a doctor sat beside my hospital bed. The look in his eyes told me the truth before he spoke. Our daughter was gone. I don't remember much from the days that followed. Only pieces. Darkness. Silence. Grief. And Ethan. Holding me. Crying beside me. We'll have another chance, he whispered through tears. We'll get through this together. I believed him. God help me, I believed every word. That memory became the reason I forgave so much afterward. Every insensitive comment. Every cruel remark. Every time Margaret made me feel broken. I kept remembering Ethan sitting beside that hospital bed. The man who cried with me. The man who promised we were a team. The man I thought I knew. Years passed. The nursery door stayed closed. The subject of children became painful. But I never imagined it would become a weapon. One Saturday evening, we hosted a small dinner party. Several friends. A few business associates. Wine. Laughter. Soft jazz playing through the speakers. The conversation drifted toward family. One of our guests smiled. Olivia, you and Ethan have been married a long time. Any plans for kids? The room became quiet. Not awkward. Just cautious. Everyone knew our history. Before I could answer, Margaret set down her wineglass. The sound echoed louder than it should have. She smiled. A small smile. The kind that never reaches the eyes. Then she said calmly, almost casually, a marriage without children isn't a real family. Silence. The entire table froze. Someone looked away. Someone else shifted uncomfortably in their seat. I felt every eye in the room move toward me. The words hit harder because they weren't shouted. They were delivered with the confidence of someone who believed she was stating a fact. I looked at Ethan. Just for a second. Waiting. Hoping. Expecting him to say something. Anything. Tell her to stop. Defend me. Take my hand. Remind her of the daughter we lost. Instead, Ethan lowered his gaze to his plate. And said nothing. Not a single word. I smiled politely. The kind of smile people wear when they're trying not to break. Then I took a sip of wine. And stayed silent. Because sometimes the most painful thing isn't what people say. It's realizing who stays quiet while they say it. And that night, sitting in a house I had built, surrounded by people I had helped, I felt something I couldn't quite name. Not anger. Not yet. Just the faintest crack. A tiny fracture forming beneath the surface of a life I thought was solid. I had no idea that everything was about to collapse. 3 days after the dinner party, the house looked exactly the same. The marble floors still gleamed. The kitchen still smelled faintly of fresh coffee every morning. The oak trees outside my office window still swayed gently in the Texas wind. From the outside, my life appeared untouched. But Margaret's words kept echoing in my head. A marriage without children isn't a real family. The sentence followed me everywhere. In meetings. During workouts. While driving through Dallas traffic. And perhaps what hurt most wasn't that she had said it. It was that Ethan had sat there and let it happen. I kept replaying the moment. Waiting for some explanation that never came. Maybe he had been shocked. Maybe he hadn't heard. Maybe he didn't know what to say. I created excuses for him because that's what people do when they love someone. They become defense attorneys for behavior that should never need defending. A week later, Ethan announced he had to travel to Houston for work. We were eating breakfast when he mentioned it. "Just 2 days," he said while scrolling through emails on his phone. "Big client meeting." I nodded. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, just busy." The answer came too quickly. Too rehearsed. But I pushed the feeling away. After all, Ethan traveled often. His position required it. At least, that's what I told myself. The following evening, he returned home around 9. He looked tired. Dropped his suitcase beside the bedroom door. Kissed my forehead. Then disappeared into the shower. Normal. Everything looked normal. The next morning, I carried his laundry downstairs. It was something I had done hundreds of times over the years. Nothing remarkable. Nothing suspicious. Until I picked up one of his shirts. I froze. A scent lingered on the collar. Soft. Sweet. Familiar. I brought the fabric closer. Smelled it again. My stomach tightened. Baby lotion. Not perfume. Not shampoo. Not hotel soap. Baby lotion. The scent was unmistakable. I knew because after losing our daughter, I had spent months unable to throw away the baby products we'd purchased. I remembered every smell. Every tiny bottle. Every unopened package. This was one of them. I stood alone in the laundry room for several seconds. Trying to think logically. Trying not to jump to conclusions. Maybe a coworker had brought a child to the office. Maybe he had hugged a client. Maybe there was a completely innocent explanation. But the uneasy feeling refused to leave. The shirt wasn't the only thing. The scent lingered on 2 others. A jacket. Even part of his suitcase. Enough to make coincidence feel unlikely. That night, I barely slept. Ethan lay beside me breathing peacefully. His arm stretched across the mattress. The same arm that had once wrapped around me in a hospital room. The same man who had cried beside me after we lost our baby. I stared into the darkness and wondered why, for the first time in years, he suddenly felt like a stranger. Around 2 in the morning, thirst pulled me out of bed. The house was quiet. I walked downstairs toward the kitchen. Halfway down the hallway, I noticed light spilling from beneath Margaret's bedroom door. That wasn't unusual. She often stayed up late watching television. But as I passed, I heard her voice. Soft. Almost affectionate. I slowed my steps. Not intentionally. Just instinctively. Then I heard a name. Noah. My heartbeat stopped. Margaret laughed softly. The kind of laugh I'd never heard directed at me. "Oh, sweetheart, Grandma misses Noah too." Silence. Then more listening. Then another smile in her voice. I know. Tell him Grandma will see him soon." I stood frozen in the hallway. Every muscle locked. Every thought suspended. Noah. Grandma. See him soon. The pieces didn't fit. At least not yet. But something inside me whispered that they would. Suddenly. Terribly. I moved away before she could open the door and discover me listening. Back in my room, I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the wall until sunrise. Ethan never woke. The next day I tried to focus on work. Failed. Tried again. Failed again. At lunch, I found myself dialing the one person who had never been afraid to tell me the truth. Sarah Mitchell. My best friend since college. One of the most respected divorce attorneys in Dallas. She answered on the second ring. "Olivia? Hey." There was a pause. "What's wrong?" I almost laughed. Sarah had always possessed an annoying ability to hear emotions before words. "Nothing." "That's a lie." I sighed. "Can we meet?" "Where?" "Your office." 1 hour. By 3 o'clock, I was sitting across from her. Sarah listened without interrupting as I explained everything. Margaret's comments. The strange scent. The phone call. The name Noah. When I finished, she folded her hands together. "What do you think is happening?" I stared out the window. "I don't know." That wasn't entirely true. I knew exactly what I was afraid of. I just wasn't ready to say it aloud. Sarah studied me carefully. "Olivia." "What?" "You trust people too much." I frowned. "That's not a crime." "No." Her voice softened. "But sometimes it's dangerous." I looked away. She continued. "For years you've defended Ethan. Because he's my husband. You defended Margaret. Because she's family. You let Rachel live in your house rent-free." I remained silent. Sarah leaned forward. "You need to stop trusting people blindly." The words landed harder than I expected. Because deep down, I knew she wasn't talking only about Ethan. She was talking about me. The version of me that always assumed people were as honest as I tried to be. The version that believed love automatically created loyalty. The version that thought sacrifice guaranteed gratitude. Sarah reached across the desk. "If there's nothing going on, you'll find nothing. And if there is?" Her eyes darkened. "Then you'll finally know the truth." The truth. For years I had convinced myself truth was always a good thing. Now I wasn't so sure. That evening, I drove home under a sky painted orange and purple by the setting Texas sun. The house stood exactly where it always had. Beautiful. Peaceful. Safe. Yet something about it felt different now. As though invisible cracks were spreading beneath the foundation. Margaret sat in the living room watching television. Rachel was scrolling through her phone. Ethan smiled when I walked through the door. "How was your day?" I smiled back. "Busy." A lie. The first lie I'd told in a very long time. Because while they sat there believing everything was normal, a decision had already been made. I was done guessing. Done explaining away suspicious behavior. Done trusting without evidence. That night, after everyone went to bed, I sat alone in my home office. The glow from my laptop illuminated the room. I opened a notebook, picked up a pen, and wrote down a single sentence. "Follow Margaret." I stared at those two words for a long moment. Then I closed the notebook. For the first time since hearing the name Noah, my mind felt clear. I didn't know what I was going to find. But I knew one thing. Whatever secret had entered my house was no longer going to remain hidden. And the next crack in my marriage was about to become impossible to ignore. The next morning, I woke up before dawn. Not because I had slept well. Because I hadn't slept at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Margaret's voice again. "Grandma Mrs. Noah." The name echoed through my mind like a loose nail scraping across glass. I moved through my morning routine mechanically. Coffee. Shower. Work emails. None of it registered. My attention stayed fixed on one thing. Margaret. At 8:43 a.m., I watched from my office window as she stepped out of the house. Rachel followed a few moments later. Neither of them looked suspicious. If anything, they looked excited. Margaret carried a large reusable shopping bag. Rachel was holding a gift box wrapped in bright blue paper. I felt my pulse quicken. They loaded everything into Rachel's SUV. Then drove away. I waited 30 seconds before grabbing my keys. My hands were already shaking. The drive took us north toward Plano. I stayed several cars behind. Traffic helped. The morning rush created enough distance that neither woman noticed me. The farther we drove, the tighter the knot in my stomach became. Part of me still hoped there was an innocent explanation. Maybe Noah was a cousin. A neighbor's child. A family friend. Anything. I would have accepted almost any explanation. Anything except the one my instincts were already screaming. 40 minutes later, Rachel's SUV pulled into a luxury apartment complex. The kind of place young professionals dream about. Modern architecture. Private parking. Landscaped courtyards. Security gates. I parked across the street. Far enough away to avoid attention. Close enough to watch. Margaret and Rachel climbed out carrying their gifts. then disappeared into Building C. I sat there for several minutes, thinking, breathing, trying to convince myself not to do something crazy. Then I got out of the car. I followed. The building lobby was quiet. A delivery driver entered just ahead of me, allowing me to slip inside without using a resident key. The elevator display showed a recent stop on the 6th floor. I pressed 6. My reflection stared back at me in the mirrored walls. Pale. Tense. Older than I remembered. The elevator doors opened. I stepped into a hallway lined with expensive carpeting and soft lighting. Then I heard laughter. Margaret's laughter. Coming from apartment 618. The door wasn't fully closed. Just slightly ajar. Enough for voices to drift into the hallway. Enough for my world to end. A woman opened the door wider. She couldn't have been older than 28. Blonde hair. Perfect makeup. Designer clothing. Beautiful in the effortless way youth often is. Samantha. Though I didn't know her name yet. Margaret's entire face transformed the moment she saw her. It was a smile I hadn't received in 8 years. There's my girl. The woman laughed. Good morning, Margaret. Then something small ran across the living room behind her. A toddler. Dark hair. Brown eyes. A little boy. Maybe 18 months old. Maybe a little older. He was laughing while dragging a stuffed dinosaur across the floor. Margaret immediately dropped her bags. Oh my goodness. Her voice cracked with affection. My handsome little man. The child ran straight toward her. She scooped him into her arms, covering his face with kisses. Rachel walked in behind her. Hey, buddy. The boy giggled. The entire scene felt disturbingly natural. Comfortable. Practiced. As if this wasn't a special visit. As if they had done this countless times before. I stood frozen near the stairwell. Unable to move. Unable to leave. Unable to breathe. Then everything became worse. Much worse. The elevator at the end of the hallway chimed. The doors opened. A familiar figure stepped out. Ethan. For a moment, my brain refused to process what my eyes were seeing. He wasn't supposed to be here. He was supposed to be working. Supposed to be in meetings. Supposed to be living the life I believed we shared. Instead, he walked toward apartment 618 like he belonged there. Like he was coming home. The little boy saw him first. His face lit up. Daddy. The word echoed down the hallway. Straight into my chest. The child ran. Tiny feet slapping against hardwood floors. Ethan bent down. Opened his arms. And caught him effortlessly. The little boy wrapped his arms around Ethan's neck. Daddy. Ethan laughed. A laugh I hadn't heard in years. Hey, buddy. Then he kissed the child's forehead. Like he'd done it 1,000 times before. The hallway blurred. My ears rang. Something inside me shattered so completely that I actually grabbed the wall to stay upright. Every excuse. Every rationalization. Every defense. Gone. There was no misunderstanding. No innocent explanation. No coincidence. My husband had another family. A real family. One he had hidden while sharing my bed every night. I don't remember getting back to the elevator. I don't remember reaching the parking lot. I only remember sitting behind the wheel of my car. Unable to start it. My hands trembled uncontrollably. Tears came without warning. Violent. Relentless. Years of trust pouring out all at once. I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel and sobbed. The kind of crying that hurts physically. The kind that leaves bruises on the soul. 5 years. 5 years since we lost our daughter. 5 years of mourning. 5 years of wondering if my body had somehow failed him. And while I was carrying that guilt, he had been building another life. Another future. Another family. Eventually nausea overwhelmed me. I stumbled out of the car. Made it to a patch of grass beside the curb. And vomited. The world spun. My knees nearly buckled. For several minutes I couldn't move. Couldn't think. Couldn't even cry anymore. Then I heard voices. Laughter. Coming from nearby. Instinctively, I looked up. The apartment window above me was partially open. Rachel's voice floated out. Sharp and unmistakable. Honestly, I don't know why Ethan hasn't divorced her already. Someone laughed. Then Rachel continued. Once the divorce is done, Olivia's house belongs to us anyway. My heart stopped. Margaret answered immediately. Exactly. Then came a chuckle. A cruel, satisfied chuckle. The poor woman has no idea. Rachel laughed. She's always been clueless. Another voice joined them. The younger woman. Samantha. So we'll all be living there? Margaret sounded delighted. The minute everything is finalized. More laughter. More celebration. As if they were discussing vacation plans. Not the destruction of another human being's life. I sat motionless in my car. Listening. Learning. Understanding. The affair wasn't the whole betrayal. The house. They wanted the house. My house. The home I purchased before I ever met Ethan. The home I spent years paying for. The home they had been treating like their future inheritance. For the first time that day, something changed. The tears stopped. Not because the pain disappeared. Because something stronger was beginning to emerge beneath it. Clarity. I looked down at my wedding ring. The diamond caught the afternoon sunlight. For years it had represented love. Commitment. Trust. Now it looked like evidence. Nothing more. I wiped my face. Took a long breath. Then another. The woman who had entered that apartment complex was devastated. Broken. Humiliated. The woman sitting in the car now was something different. Still wounded. Still grieving. But no longer blind. I started the engine. My hands were finally steady. As I pulled away from the curb, I glanced once in the rearview mirror. The luxury building disappeared behind me. Along with the last illusion I had about my marriage. The pain was still there. It would be there for a long time. But beneath the pain, something else had been born. Resolve. And for the first time since hearing the name Noah, I wasn't thinking about what I had lost. I was thinking about what they were about to lose. There are moments in life when grief turns into clarity. Not all at once. Not dramatically. It happens quietly. Like a storm finally passing and revealing the landscape it destroyed. The drive back from Plano felt endless. I don't remember the traffic. I don't remember the radio. I don't remember anything except the image of that little boy running into Ethan's arms. Daddy. One word. One simple word. Yet it had erased 8 years of lies. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the sun was beginning to set over Dallas. The house stood exactly as it always had. Elegant. Impressive. Beautiful. For years, I had looked at it and seen a home. Now I saw something else. An asset. A legal reality. A fact. Facts, unlike people, do not betray you. I sat in my car for a few moments before going inside. The lights were on. Rachel's SUV was already parked in the driveway. Apparently, their little family gathering had ended. How fitting. They were celebrating their future while standing inside a house that wasn't theirs. I walked through the front door. Margaret was watching television. Rachel sat on the couch scrolling through social media. Neither looked guilty. Neither looked nervous. Why would they? They believed they were winning. Rachel glanced up. Hey, Olivia. I smiled politely. Hey. Margaret barely acknowledged me. Just a small nod before returning her attention to the television. For a brief moment, I wondered how long the deception had been going on. Months? Years? Had they laughed behind my back every time I left for work? Had they discussed Samantha at this very kitchen table? Had they planned my replacement while living under my roof? The questions no longer hurt as much as they should have. Because something had changed. I finally understood what kind of people they were. And understanding is powerful. I went upstairs. Closed my bedroom door. then walked directly to the custom-built bookshelf on the far wall. Most people thought it was decorative. Few knew it concealed a hidden safe. I entered the code. The lock clicked. The steel door swung open. Inside sat several folders. Bank documents. Investment records. Property files. The paperwork of a life built carefully over decades. I reached for the folder labeled White Oak Estate, the legal name of my property. The house everyone downstairs seemed convinced belonged to them. I carried the folder to the bed, opened it, and for the first time since leaving Plano, I smiled. Not because I was happy. Because I finally remembered something important. The truth. Inside were the original documents. Purchase agreements. Closing disclosures. Mortgage paperwork. Property tax records. Everything. I flipped through the pages slowly. Each document carried the same name. Olivia Grace Carter. Mine. Mine alone. The purchase date sat clearly at the top of the first page. 14 months before my wedding. 14 months before Ethan Brooks ever became my husband. According to Texas law, that fact changed everything. The house was separate property. Not marital property. Not community property. Not jointly owned. Separate. Mine. Completely. Legally. Irrefutably. I leaned back against the headboard and closed my eyes. For the first time all day, I felt something close to peace. Not because the betrayal hurt less, but because facts are immune to manipulation. No amount of lying could change a signed deed. No amount of greed could rewrite ownership records. No amount of entitlement could alter Texas property law. Downstairs, Rachel probably believed she was planning her future. In reality, she was planning her own disappointment. A strange laugh escaped my lips. The sound startled even me. I hadn't laughed all day. Maybe because I had finally found solid ground. My gaze drifted toward the window. Darkness had settled outside. The city lights shimmered in the distance. And suddenly, memories began flooding back. Not memories of Ethan. Memories of me. The woman I had been before I built my life around someone else. I remembered signing the purchase contract. I had been 30 years old. Exhausted. Ambitious. Terrified. I remembered sitting inside the title company's office. A stack of papers nearly 2 inches thick spread across the table. The realtor had smiled. "Congratulations, Ms. Carter." I had looked around in disbelief. The house felt impossible. Too large. Too beautiful. Too expensive. A dream I wasn't sure I deserved. But I had earned every inch of it. Nobody had given me anything. Nobody had rescued me. Nobody had paid my bills. I had worked for it. The memories continued. 16-hour workdays. Weekend meetings. Missed vacations. Late-night conference calls. Years of sacrifice. Years of choosing responsibility over comfort. While my friends were enjoying holidays, I was building a company. While others slept, I was solving problems. While people talked about dreams, I was chasing mine. That house wasn't luck. It wasn't inheritance. It wasn't a gift. It was proof. Proof of discipline. Proof of perseverance. Proof that a woman could build something extraordinary with her own hands. Tears filled my eyes again. But these were different tears. Not grief. Not loss. Pride. Somewhere along the way, I had forgotten who I was. I had spent so many years being a wife that I stopped remembering the woman who existed before the marriage. The woman who built businesses. Created opportunities. Changed lives. The woman who didn't need anyone's permission to succeed. The woman who had survived long before Ethan Brooks entered the picture. I sat quietly for a long time. Thinking. Remembering. Rebuilding. Then I gathered every property document. Every mortgage record. Every deed. Every supporting file. I placed them neatly inside a secure leather portfolio. Tomorrow, they would be moved somewhere safer. Somewhere no one in this house could access. No one except me. As midnight approached, I finally reached for my phone. There was one more thing I needed to do. One conversation. One step. One decision. I scrolled through my contacts until I found a number I hadn't used in nearly 2 years. My thumb hovered over the screen. Then I pressed call. The line rang once. Twice. 3 times. A man's voice answered. Hello? I stood by the window overlooking the backyard. The pool lights reflected softly across the water. For a moment, I watched the ripples. Then I spoke. It's Olivia. There was a pause. Then recognition. Olivia Carter. Yes. Another pause. Longer this time. As though he already sensed something serious. Everything okay? I looked back toward the closed bedroom door. Toward the people downstairs. Toward the life that had just fallen apart. Then I answered. For the first time since discovering the truth, my voice didn't shake. It was calm. Steady. Certain. It's time. Silence. The man didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. Because some conversations begin long before the first word is spoken. Finally, he replied. Understood. The call ended. I placed the phone on the nightstand. Then looked out across the dark Dallas skyline once more. Downstairs, my husband's family believed they were moving closer to victory. They had no idea they were standing on the edge of a cliff. And they had no idea I had just taken the first step toward pushing them over it. The strange thing about betrayal is that once you finally see it, you start noticing things that were always there. The signs. The patterns. The lies hidden inside ordinary moments. For years, I had explained everything away. Now, I couldn't stop seeing the truth. The morning after I reviewed the house documents, I arrived at my bank before it opened. The leather portfolio sat beside me on the passenger seat. Every document that mattered was inside. The deed. The purchase contract. Mortgage records. Property tax statements. Proof. The kind of proof people like Ethan, Margaret, and Rachel never bothered to think about because they were too busy counting money that wasn't theirs. At exactly 9 o'clock, I walked into the bank and rented a private safe deposit box. The manager smiled politely while explaining procedures. I barely listened. My attention remained fixed on the documents. One by one, I placed them inside. When the metal door closed with a heavy click, a surprising sense of relief washed over me. For the first time in days, I felt protected. Not emotionally. Legally. And legal protection was becoming far more important than emotional comfort. After leaving the bank, I drove directly to Sarah's office. She was waiting with coffee. Black. No sugar. Exactly how I liked it. She slid a folder across her desk. What is this? Everything you need to know if things get ugly. I opened it. Texas property law. Divorce procedures. Financial protection measures. Documentation strategies. Sarah wasn't preparing me for a fight. She was preparing me to survive one. She leaned back in her chair. Tell me something. What? Are you absolutely sure you want to keep pretending you know nothing? I nodded. Yes. She studied me carefully. Why? I looked out the window. Because I wanted to see how far they would go. Because part of me needed confirmation. Because sometimes the truth isn't fully revealed until people think they've already won. They're digging their own hole, I finally said. Sarah's expression hardened. Then let them keep digging. That afternoon, I hired a security company. Not for protection. For observation. Within 48 hours, discrete cameras were installed throughout the house. Living room. Kitchen. Garage. Backyard. Main hallways. Not bedrooms or private spaces. Just enough to document behavior. Just enough to create a record. Just enough to expose the truth if necessary. The technician handed me access through a secure phone app. I thanked him and went back to pretending everything was normal. For a few days, nothing happened. Then Rachel got impatient. I should have known she'd be the first one to make a mistake. She wasn't patient enough to hide who she really was. Thursday evening, I arrived home after a long meeting downtown. The second I stepped inside, I heard shouting. Rachel's voice. Loud. Dramatic. Almost theatrical. Are you kidding me? I walked into the living room. A shattered antique vase lay across the hardwood floor. Blue and white porcelain fragments everywhere. The vase had belonged to my grandmother. It wasn't just expensive. It was irreplaceable. Margaret sat on the couch looking horrified. Rachel stood nearby holding her phone. Recording. The moment I entered, Rachel pointed directly at me. There she is. I blinked. What happened? Rachel laughed bitterly. What happened? She raised the phone higher. You tell me. I stared at her. Then at the broken vase. Then back at her. Slowly, the pieces began falling into place. Not the vase. The setup. Rachel stepped forward dramatically. You got angry and knocked it over. My jaw tightened. What? You heard me. Rachel, I wasn't even home. That's not what happened. I looked toward Margaret. She immediately lowered her eyes. Interesting. Not supportive. Not convincing. Just guilty. Rachel continued recording, clearly hoping for a reaction. An argument. A scene. Something she could use. I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I remained calm. Do you really want to do this? Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Only a fraction. Then it returned. I don't know what you're talking about. Of course she didn't. The camera had already captured everything. Not her version. The real version. I knew because I had watched it 15 minutes earlier through the security app. Rachel herself had knocked the vase off the table while trying to reposition furniture. Then she spent several minutes planning how to blame me. Every second had been recorded. I didn't mention any of that. Not yet. Instead, I simply walked away. Behind me, Rachel looked confused. Almost disappointed. Predators hated when prey refuses to panic. Later that night, I sat alone in my office reviewing camera footage. The vase incident wasn't the only thing I'd discovered. There was something else. Something much more interesting. Something that had nothing to do with Rachel. And everything to do with Ethan. For years, I had trusted him with access to certain financial accounts. Not my personal assets, but household spending accounts. Shared expenses. Authorized business reimbursements. A few regular transactions had caught my attention. Small at first. Then larger. Then impossible to ignore. I opened several reports. Cross-referenced dates. Reviewed statements. My stomach tightened. Restaurants. Luxury shopping. Hotel charges. Jewelry purchases. None connected to our life. None connected to me. Most interesting of all, several expenses had been submitted through Ethan's corporate account. Improperly. In ways his employer definitely wouldn't appreciate. I continued digging. The pattern became obvious. Money had been flowing toward Samantha. Not directly. Indirectly. Carefully. But not carefully enough. One payment covered rent. Another paid for furniture. Another purchased electronics. The total climbed into the thousands. Then tens of thousands. I leaned back in my chair. For the first time, I understood something important. The affair wasn't only emotional. It wasn't only physical. It was financial. Ethan wasn't just betraying me. He was stealing from his future. Possibly from his company too. I immediately saved copies of everything. Organized them. Backed them up. Stored them securely. Not because I planned to use them. Because I suspected someone eventually would. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. Ethan entered my office. He looked tired. Loosened tie. Half-buttoned shirt. The familiar image of a husband coming home after a long day. Only now I knew where some of those days had actually been spent. You still working? I looked up. A little. He smiled. You work too much. The irony almost made me laugh. Instead, I studied him carefully. The man I'd once trusted more than anyone. The man who had another child. Another woman. Another life. How was Houston? I asked casually. His expression remained neutral. Busy. Good meetings? Very productive. A lie. Smooth. Automatic. Practiced. I nodded slowly. Then decided to take a risk. A small one. Just enough. Just a glimpse. That's good. He relaxed slightly. Then I added. I imagine balancing 2 households must be expensive these days. The room instantly changed. Not dramatically. Subtly. But unmistakably. The color drained from Ethan's face. Only for a second. Then he recovered. What? I closed my laptop. Looked directly into his eyes. And smiled. A calm smile. The kind that reveals nothing. Oh, nothing. Silence. Heavy silence. The kind that stretches too long. For the first time since I'd known him, Ethan looked uncertain. Nervous. Almost frightened. Olivia. Yeah? What did you mean by that? I stood and walked past him toward the door. Then paused. Just long enough. Just cruel enough. And said quietly. Never mind, I'm sure it was nothing. I left him standing there. Alone. Confused. Watching me walk away. For the first time in years, Ethan Brooks looked genuinely afraid. And that fear told me something important. He knew exactly what I meant. The funny thing about people who think they're smarter than everyone else is that eventually, they become careless. Greed makes people impatient. Entitlement makes people reckless. And Rachel Brooks was becoming both. After my conversation with Ethan in the office, the atmosphere inside the house changed. Not on the surface. Outwardly, everything looked normal. Margaret still watched television every evening. Rachel still wandered around the house as though she owned it. Ethan still pretended to be a husband. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. I could feel it. Ethan was nervous. The confidence he had worn for months was beginning to crack. Several times I caught him staring at me when he thought I wasn't looking. Watching. Evaluating. Trying to determine how much I knew. The answer was simple. Everything. But he didn't know that. And that uncertainty was eating him alive. 3 days later, Rachel decided to force the situation. It happened on a Sunday afternoon. The house was unusually quiet. I was in my home office reviewing documents when a scream shattered the silence. Oh my God. Rachel. I didn't move immediately. A second scream followed. Then Margaret's voice. Panicked. Weak. Dramatic. Rachel. I stood slowly. Almost impressed. They weren't even trying to be subtle anymore. When I entered the living room, the performance was already underway. Margaret was lying across the sofa clutching her chest. Rachel knelt beside her. Crying. Or pretending to cry. The tears were impressive. If I hadn't known her better, I might have believed them. What happened? I asked calmly. Rachel spun toward me. Her face twisted with outrage. You happened. There it was. The accusation. Right on schedule. Margaret let out a weak groan. Oh, my heart. Rachel pointed at me. Look what you've done. I folded my arms. What exactly did I do? You've been stressing her out for months. I blinked. Really? Don't act innocent. Margaret released another dramatic gasp. I can't take this anymore. Rachel immediately grabbed her hand. It's okay, Mom. Mom. Interesting. When Rachel wanted sympathy, Margaret suddenly became Mom instead of Margaret. I glanced around the room. No ambulance. No emergency call. No urgency. Just theater. The cameras hidden throughout the house were recording everything. Every lie. Every fake tear. Every exaggerated gasp. Rachel stood up abruptly. This family is falling apart because of you. The statement hung in the air. I almost laughed. Instead, I remained silent. That seemed to irritate her even more. She wanted a fight. An explosion. Something she could use. When she didn't get it, her frustration became visible. Ethan entered the room a few moments later. Perfect timing. Almost as if everyone had rehearsed their positions beforehand. His expression was serious. Concerned. Convincing. If I hadn't seen him holding another woman's child days earlier, I might have admired the performance. "What happened?" he asked. Rachel answered immediately. "Mom's chest started hurting." Margaret groaned again. Ethan looked toward me. The blame was already in his eyes. Convenient. Predictable. Cowardly. "What happened before that?" he asked. Rachel didn't hesitate. Olivia was arguing with her. A lie. A complete lie. I hadn't spoken to Margaret all morning. Ethan stared at me. Waiting. Maybe hoping I'd defend myself. Maybe hoping I'd lose control. Instead, I simply shrugged. I wasn't. Rachel scoffed. Seriously? I smiled. The reaction confused her. Because innocent people usually become emotional when falsely accused. I wasn't emotional anymore. I was observing. And observers are dangerous. The next 30 minutes unfolded exactly as I expected. More accusations. More dramatics. More attempts to paint me as the villain. Finally, Ethan stood. Walked out of the room. Then returned carrying a folder. A familiar folder. My pulse didn't change. But Rachel's did. Her eyes lit up. Margaret suddenly looked much healthier. Interesting. Very interesting. Ethan placed the folder on the dining table. The room grew quiet. Rachel could barely contain her excitement. I already knew what was inside before he opened it. Divorce papers. The final stage of their plan. The moment they believed would change everything. Ethan slowly slid the documents toward me. His voice was cold. Detached. Almost arrogant. "I think we've reached the end." I looked down at the paperwork. Then back at him. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "Sign it." Rachel smiled. Margaret sat up straighter. Miraculously recovering from her apparent medical emergency. I almost admired the timing. Ethan's next words came exactly as expected. "Sign it and leave my house." For a moment, nobody moved. The room became perfectly still. Then I laughed. Not loudly. Just enough. Ethan frowned. Rachel looked confused. Margaret looked offended. I tilted my head slightly. "Your house?" Ethan straightened his shoulders. "That's right." The confidence in his voice would have been impressive if it weren't so ridiculous. I stared at him. Really stared at him. At the man whose debts I helped pay. Whose career I helped build. Whose family I had supported for years. The man who had another child. Another woman. Another life. And somehow believed he owned the home I bought before I ever met him. The irony was breathtaking. Rachel crossed her arms. "Just sign the papers." I looked at her. Then at Margaret. Then back at Ethan. And finally said the words I had been carrying for days. I'd rather die alone than spend another day living with parasites. Silence. Pure silence. Rachel's face darkened immediately. Margaret gasped. Ethan clenched his jaw. Good. For once, the truth was in the room. I picked up the pen. The moment they saw it, something changed. Excitement. Victory. Greed. They thought they had won. That was the funniest part. I signed. Without hesitation. Without argument. Without tears. My signature flowed smoothly across the page. Olivia Carter. Done. The reaction was immediate. Rachel actually laughed. A loud, ugly laugh. Margaret looked relieved. Ethan seemed almost shocked by how easy it had been. As though he had expected resistance. A fight. Begging. None came. I slid the papers back across the table. There. Rachel couldn't stop smiling. The second the paperwork was complete, every mask in the room disappeared. Margaret stood. Perfectly healthy. No chest pain. No weakness. No emergency. Rachel walked straight to the kitchen. A few moments later, I heard the unmistakable pop of a champagne bottle. I watched Ethan carefully. Even now, some small part of him seemed unsettled. As if he couldn't understand why I wasn't devastated. Meanwhile, Rachel poured drinks. Margaret raised a glass. The celebration had already begun. Then came the moment that removed all remaining doubt. Rachel pulled out her phone. Grinning. "Call Samantha." Margaret laughed. "Oh, she needs to hear this." A few moments later, Samantha answered on speakerphone. "Hello?" Rachel practically sang the words. "It's done." Excited laughter exploded from the phone. Margaret clapped her hands. "When are you bringing Noah over?" "Soon." "Good." Margaret smiled. "He deserves his room." "His room? In my house?" Or so they thought. I stood quietly, watching them reveal their true selves. No shame. No guilt. No remorse. Just greed. The kind that eventually destroys people from the inside out. I turned and walked upstairs. No one stopped me. They were too busy celebrating. I packed a single suitcase. Only essentials. Clothes. Laptop. Personal documents. A few photographs. Nothing else mattered. By the time I carried the suitcase downstairs, champagne glasses were still raised. Rachel was discussing renovations. Margaret was talking about Noah. Samantha's voice continued drifting through the phone. Ethan stood silently among them. Not celebrating. But not stopping them either. That told me everything I needed to know. I rolled my suitcase toward the front door. For the first time, Ethan looked directly at me. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing left to say. I opened the door. The warm Texas evening air greeted me. Behind me, laughter continued. Champagne flowed. Plans were made. Dreams were shared. None of them realizing those dreams were built on a foundation that didn't belong to them. I stepped outside, closed the door behind me, and walked away from the house. The house they believed they had just won. The house they were about to lose. The first night after I left the house, I slept at the Ritz-Carlton in Dallas. Or at least, I tried to. The suite was beautiful. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline. The bed was softer than anything I had ever owned. The room was silent, peaceful, safe. Yet I spent most of the night staring at the ceiling. Not because I regretted leaving. Because I was finally beginning to understand the full weight of what had happened. 8 years. 8 years of marriage. 8 years of sacrifices. 8 years of believing I was building a life with someone. And now it was over. Not because of one mistake. Not because of one affair. But because the people I had trusted most had spent years becoming strangers. Around 3 in the morning, I got up and walked toward the window. Dallas glittered beneath me. Thousands of lights stretching across the darkness. Somewhere out there, people were falling in love. Getting married. Making promises. Some would keep those promises. Others wouldn't. I thought about Ethan. Not with anger. Not anymore. Mostly with disappointment. The man I had married no longer existed. Maybe he never had. My phone buzzed. A message from Sarah. "How are you holding up?" I stared at the screen for a moment. Then typed. "Still breathing." A few seconds later she replied. "Good, keep doing that." I smiled despite myself. Sarah had always known exactly what to say. The next morning, I had a meeting. One that would change everything. At 10 o'clock, I arrived at a private office building in downtown Dallas. The receptionist escorted me to a conference room. A man was already waiting inside. Mid-50s. Silver hair. Tailored navy suit. Calm eyes. Confident posture. Vincent Russo. The mysterious person I had called several days earlier. A successful real estate investor. A man known for closing difficult deals quickly. He stood and shook my hand. "Olivia." "Vincent. Sorry we're meeting under these circumstances." "So am I." He gestured toward a chair. We sat. The property file was already open on the table between us. Vincent reviewed several pages before looking up. Beautiful house. It was. The word slipped out before I could stop it. Was. Not is. Because emotionally, I had already left. Vincent nodded. You understand market value? I do. The property would probably sell for around $1.45 million right now. I nodded again. The number matched my own estimates. He leaned forward. If we move quickly, I can offer $1.35. Most homeowners would negotiate. Most would wait. Most would chase every dollar. I wasn't most homeowners. What are the conditions? Cash transaction. I expected that. Fast closing. Good. And immediate transfer of possession rights after closing. Exactly what I wanted. I didn't need maximum profit. I needed speed. I needed certainty. And most importantly, I needed everything to be completely legal. I extended my hand. You have a deal. Vincent shook it. Neither of us smiled. Business wasn't emotional. Business was facts. Contracts. Signatures. Reality. Something Ethan and his family were about to learn the hard way. Over the next several days, paperwork moved rapidly. Lawyers reviewed documents. Title companies verified ownership. Financial transfers were arranged. Everything happened exactly as Texas law required. Clean. Professional. Unavoidable. Meanwhile, life inside the house continued. Or rather, it deteriorated. Every evening, I opened the security app on my phone. And watched. Not because I enjoyed it. Because information matters. The first day after my departure, Rachel practically danced through the house. I watched her stand in the middle of the living room holding a glass of wine. This place finally feels like ours. Margaret laughed. It should have been ours years ago. I nearly choked on my coffee. Years ago? Interesting. Apparently they had been planning ownership of my property long before Samantha entered the picture. The second day became even worse. Rachel started making changes. Without permission. Without hesitation. Without understanding. She entered my home office carrying trash bags. The office where I had built my company. The office where I spent thousands of hours working. The office that represented decades of effort. She looked around dismissively. Then started throwing things away. Books. Awards. Personal items. Photographs. Anything she considered unnecessary. I watched in disbelief. Then came the artwork. A framed painting hanging above the fireplace. Not priceless. But valuable. Worth several $1,000s. Rachel stared at it for a moment. Then simply pulled it off the wall. The frame struck the floor. Glass shattered. Margaret gasped. Rachel laughed. It's ours now anyway. The sentence echoed through the speakers. I replayed it twice. Just to make sure I heard correctly. Then I saved the video. Not because I needed evidence. Because one day I wanted to remember exactly how entitled she had become. The following evening, things escalated further. Rachel and Margaret began discussing renovations. Not future renovations. Immediate ones. They wanted to turn my office into Noah's playroom. My library into a nursery. My reading lounge into Samantha's workspace. Every room in the house was being reassigned. Redistributed. Claimed. As if ownership already belonged to them. The arrogance was almost impressive. Almost. The funniest part was Ethan. He rarely participated. He mostly watched. Quiet. Distracted. Uneasy. Sometimes I caught him staring into empty space. Other times I noticed him checking his phone repeatedly. Almost as if anxiety had begun following him. Good. It should. Because deep down, I suspected Ethan finally realized something wasn't right. People who are truly victorious don't spend their days worrying. They celebrate. Ethan wasn't celebrating. He was waiting. Perhaps he couldn't understand why I had signed so easily. Perhaps he expected a legal battle. Perhaps he wondered what I knew. Whatever the reason, he looked increasingly uncomfortable. Rachel, however, remained blissfully ignorant. One evening she walked through the dining room carrying a tape measure. Measuring walls. Discussing furniture placement. Planning future parties. Dreaming dreams built entirely on assumptions. I watched the footage while sitting in my hotel suite. Then checked my email. A new message had arrived. Subject. Closing confirmation. I opened it immediately. The transaction was complete. Every document signed. Every verification completed. Every legal requirement satisfied. The property officially belonged to Vincent Russo. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Today. I stared at the screen. For several seconds, I felt absolutely nothing. No triumph. No joy. No revenge. Just certainty. The house was gone. And with it, the final illusion connecting me to my old life. A few minutes later, my phone rang. Vincent. I answered. It's done? I asked. It's done. I walked toward the hotel window. Dallas glowed beneath the evening sky. And possession? Vincent's voice remained calm. My attorneys are preparing everything now. I smiled. Not because I was happy. Because justice was finally beginning to move. When? There was a brief pause. Then Vincent answered. Very soon. I ended the call and looked out across the city. Somewhere inside that house, Rachel was probably planning paint colors. Margaret was probably imagining family dinners. Samantha was probably choosing furniture. And Ethan was probably trying to convince himself everything would work out. None of them knew the truth. None of them understood what had already happened. The house they were celebrating. The house they were redesigning. The house they believed they had won. No longer belonged to me. And it certainly didn't belong to them. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself a small smile. Because the next chapter of their story was about to begin. And they weren't going to like it. The party started at noon. I know because I watched the first guests arrive through the security cameras that were still connected to my phone. For a few moments, I simply sat in silence inside my penthouse overlooking White Rock Lake. Coffee in hand. Phone on the table. Watching people celebrate a victory that didn't exist. Rachel was wearing a white dress. Not quite bridal. But close enough to send a message. Margaret looked happier than I had seen her in years. The bitterness that usually lived on her face had disappeared completely. Apparently greed was excellent medicine. Even Ethan was smiling. Not often. Not naturally. But enough. Enough to convince himself that the future he wanted was finally within reach. Then Samantha arrived. She stepped out of a black SUV carrying Noah. The little boy looked happy. Innocent. Completely unaware of the chaos surrounding him. Unlike the adults, Noah wasn't responsible for any of this. He was simply a child caught in the consequences of other people's choices. Rachel practically ran outside to greet them. There they are. Margaret rushed forward. My grandson. Samantha smiled. Noah laughed. The family portrait was complete. Or so they thought. I glanced at the clock. 12:47 p.m. Almost time. A few minutes later, another vehicle entered the driveway. Then another. Then another. The smiles disappeared immediately. Rachel frowned. Who's that? The first man to step out was Vincent Russo. Calm. Professional. Confident. Directly behind him came two attorneys. A process server. And a county constable. Not there for drama. Not there for revenge. There for procedure. The only thing more powerful than emotion is paperwork. The front door opened. Confusion spread across every face. Vincent approached calmly. Good afternoon. Rachel crossed her arms. Can I help you? Vincent nodded. Actually, yes. One of the attorneys stepped forward. Who is Ethan Brooks? The smile vanished from Ethan's face. I'm Ethan. The attorney handed him a packet. Ethan glanced at it casually. Then looked again. And again. His expression changed immediately. "What is this?" The attorney's voice remained calm. "A notice to vacate." Silence. Complete silence. Rachel laughed nervously. "This has to be some kind of mistake." "It isn't." Margaret stepped forward. "What are you talking about?" The attorney opened another folder. "The property has been sold." The words landed like a bomb. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. For several seconds, they simply stared. Rachel blinked. "What?" "The property was legally sold to Mr. Vincent Russo." She laughed again. Louder this time. More desperate. "You can't sell somebody else's house." Vincent finally spoke. "Correct." Rachel smirked, clearly believing she had won. Then Vincent added, "Which is why Ms. Carter sold her own house." The color drained from Rachel's face. Margaret looked confused. Samantha stopped smiling. And Ethan? Ethan looked terrified. The attorney placed several documents on the dining room table. Ownership records. Purchase history. Property transfers. Every page told the same story. The house had never belonged to Ethan. Never belonged to Margaret. Never belonged to Rachel. Not even for a single day. Ethan picked up the first document. His hands visibly shaking. Then he saw it. The purchase date. 14 months before our wedding. He flipped to the next page. Then another. Then another. Each one carried the same name. Olivia Grace Carter. His breathing changed. Slowly at first. Then noticeably. Because for the first time, he wasn't looking at assumptions. He was looking at facts. And facts don't care about feelings. I watched through the camera as realization spread across his face. Not just realization. Memory. I could almost see it happening. The day I signed the mortgage. The years I worked 16-hour shifts. The nights I stayed awake balancing business finances. The promotions I helped him earn. The debt I helped him pay. The life I built. Every piece of it had existed before him. And suddenly Ethan understood something that should have been obvious all along. He had never created any of it. Not the company. Not the wealth. Not the house. Not the opportunities. He had simply been allowed to live inside someone else's dream. Rachel grabbed the paperwork. "This can't be right." The attorney looked unimpressed. "It is." Margaret sat down heavily. Her face pale. No dramatic performance this time. No fake chest pains. Just genuine shock. Samantha slowly turned toward Ethan. "You told me the house was yours." Nobody answered. Because nobody could. The truth was sitting on the table. Signed. Stamped. Recorded. Legal. Final. The attorney continued. "You have 7 days to vacate the property." Rachel exploded. "You can't do this." The county constable finally spoke. "Ma'am, this is a lawful notice." The party ended right there. No music. No celebration. No future. Only panic. Over the next week, everything fell apart. Exactly as greed always does. Every day brought new arguments. New accusations. New blame. The security cameras recorded all of it. Rachel screaming at Ethan. Margaret crying. Samantha demanding answers. Nobody trusted anybody anymore. The fantasy had collapsed. 7 days later, the county constable returned. This time there were no warnings. No discussions. No negotiations. Only enforcement. I didn't watch the entire process. Not because I felt sorry for them. Because I no longer needed to. The chapter was over. Still, curiosity eventually got the better of me. I opened the camera feed. Boxes lined the driveway. Furniture covered the lawn. Suitcases sat beside the curb. The Brooks family stood among the wreckage of their own decisions. Then came the final blow. Samantha arrived. She stepped out of her vehicle carrying Noah. Ethan rushed toward her. Desperate. Hopeful. Broken. "Sam, wait." She didn't smile. Didn't move. Didn't comfort him. Instead, she looked around. At the boxes. At the furniture. At the humiliation. Then she looked directly at Ethan. "You lied to me. Please. You promised us a future." Ethan's voice cracked. "We can still make this work." She laughed. Not kindly. Not cruelly. Just honestly. The way people laugh when they finally stop pretending. Then she said the sentence that destroyed whatever remained of him. "I loved the future you promised. Not the man you are." Silence. Ethan stood frozen. No argument. No defense. Because there wasn't one. Samantha adjusted Noah on her hip. Turned around. Walked back to her vehicle. And drove away. Without looking back. Just like that. The second family disappeared. A month later, Ethan lost his job. His employer discovered irregular expense reports. Unauthorized reimbursements. Misused corporate funds. The investigation was brief. The outcome was inevitable. Rachel found part-time work at a retail store. For the first time in her adult life, nobody was paying her bills. Margaret moved into a small apartment she could barely afford. Reality proved much less comfortable than entitlement. As for me, life moved forward. 6 months later, I stood on the balcony of my penthouse overlooking White Rock Lake. The morning sun reflected across the water. Peaceful. Quiet. Beautiful. Below, the city continued living its life. People working. Dreaming. Beginning again. Inside, several children sat around a large table. My scholarship foundation had grown faster than expected. More women receiving support. More children receiving opportunities. More lives changing. One little girl approached me while holding a drawing she'd made. She couldn't have been older than 8. She smiled. Then asked a simple question. "Do you have kids?" For a moment, I looked at the lake. At the sunlight. At the life waiting ahead. Then I smiled back. "Not yet." The little girl tilted her head. I laughed softly. "But life still has a lot of beautiful surprises." She smiled and ran back to the table. I watched her go. And for the first time in years, the future didn't feel empty. It felt open. Full of possibilities. Full of peace. Full of hope. Because sometimes losing the wrong people is how we finally make room for the right life. And if there's one thing this experience taught me, it's this. They thought my worth was measured by the child I couldn't have. In the end, their downfall was measured by the integrity they never had.